Hello and welcome to the Effective Literacy Podcast. I am Victoria.
And I'm Anna.
And we're excited to have you with us today. As you've heard on our previous episodes, Anna and I are educators who share a passion for reading and all things literacy. We know that literacy opens doors to reading and language skills through that meaningful engagement. We've recently noticed an escalation of research and opinions around what are the best practices when it comes to reading instruction, specifically the role of phonics in reading instruction. To better understand the newest research, we are interviewing experts from across the nation with extensive knowledge in literacy and multilingual education to discuss how to support our students, specifically our multilingual learners, in becoming literate individuals by the time they graduate from our educational system.
Today, we are so excited to be chatting with Susana Johnson. Welcome, Susana.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
So, Susana Ibarra Johnson is a Ph.D. assistant professor of bilingual education and TESOL at New Mexico State University. She is a former bilingual education teacher, and her understanding and devotion go beyond academic training to her own experience as a bilingual learner. As a former biliteracy researcher and senior consultant for the WIDA Consortium, she conducted research and facilitated professional learning and language development, both in English and Spanish. And currently, as an assistant professor, she specializes in developing courses for bilingual, multilingual, and biliteracy curriculum and instruction, as well as assessment with bilingual and TESOL educators. Her qualitative research focuses on translanguaging, which we're excited to hear about because lots of people are using that term right now, focusing on translanguaging pedagogy and bilingual education and English language development context to promote quality and effective bilingual education instructional programs and materials for emergent bilingual students. Wow, you sound like a very busy lady. We are really glad that you set some time aside for us and for this conversation today. So thank you again for being here with us. As Victoria said, we are looking to really talk with experts from around the nation around effective literacy, get people's perspectives so that we can take that back to our classrooms and think about how are we implementing best practices. So in your experience, in your research, in all the classrooms that I'm sure that you've been in and educators that you have worked with, when you think about effective literacy instruction, what is it that you are looking for? What does it look like? What does it sound like when we're doing it right?
Well, it's great to be here, though. I think it's, especially in probably the last couple of years with some national initiatives that have been going on with literacy. In particular, I know in New Mexico, we've been very involved with some of the literacy that has been implemented in our state districts and schools, and even in higher education. So thank you for inviting me. I think for me, what is important is that when I think of what I hear, what I see, and if you think of all the five senses in the classrooms, one of the things that I think is critical, and I think this is why a lot of the work that I do with, for example, with NSEL or even in my classroom, is that it does have to be comprehensive and it has to be effective. And so we all have, of course, definitions of what is comprehensive, what is effective. We have all these different measures that we use that, but in particular, reading has to be drawn from, for example, from the students. For me, it's important from the student's social cultural perspective of who they are, and also looking at culturally relevant pedagogy, and then also looking at their multilingualism. How do we draw from that? So in a classroom, just to give you an example, even from my own experience, when I taught first grade, I taught for a couple of years, and although it's been a while, it was very memorable for me because I looped with my students from kinder to third grade. From first grade to third grade. And that emergent initial type of literacy that I had to teach was something that I didn't have the skills as much as I thought I did, but learning from conferences like from Barbara Flores, Kathy Escamilla, just in my bilingual education experience, I was able to learn for approaches that that my students can then have those reading skills that they needed in context, right? So they had to be in context, and I use very rich literature for them to be able to draw on their funds of knowledge. For example, are their experiences, their backgrounds, and they connect it to it. And so I think that for me is very important. It's very underrepresented in literacy, or even by literacy, which is a lot of my work, that we kind of detach ourselves from the students' backgrounds, the students' home language, the students, like Luis Moll's work of funds of knowledge. What is it that they know? What are their home literacies that they do? I mean, if they're coming from a very oral tradition, how do we leverage that in the classroom? So I think in being able to do that with my students in first grade, they were able to, as Paulo Freire says, read the word and be in the world, as in the word and the world. And so I think that's very important for me, because I think if they're able to do that, they start being more engaged, more motivated, and become better readers. And so for me, it's the excitement that I see when they're able to break the code. And then, as I said, with these particular students that I was with for 3 years. But then as we moved on, I can definitely share how they were able to then create their own text, using modal types of ways, multi-literacies ways, and multilingual ways. So I think for me, it has to be fun too. They have to be engaged, which makes it fun in the sense of like creating readers' theaters, for example. So we always just kind of think that, it has to be, but I know it's important. And this is, I think, kind of the national call that, well, how do we, our students are not reading at grade level. But I think, it depends on the assessments that you use and so forth. But I really believe that literacy engagement is important, but then also having, teaching the reading skills in context, in comprehensive ways, integrating meaning making and language development is very important though. So again, this whole decontextualized way of, for example, some of the structural literacy that I see my teachers do, is too decontextualized. I mean, that's not how human beings learn. And so I think, and I know for certain my students that I spend so much time in my classroom, it was just not. I mean, you just don't learn that way, and from personal and professional experience. So I think that's kind of what I hear and see with my students.
Yeah. And I mean, just to kind of go back to what you were saying, the whole idea of it needs to be fun, and decontextualized learning is really boring. So it may be fun for a couple of kiddos, but for when you're looking at, 25 first graders, that decontextualize, really separate learning, like this is when we focus on this one in particular skill. I mean, that's just asking to, have 25 first graders falling off your rug,
That's right.
So this idea of getting the kids in the words, getting them engaged in meaningful books and experiences, I think is definitely something that we need to keep in mind as we start to analyze all the different research that's coming up right now.
Mm-hmm.
So, Susana, you said something about the whole idea that we have to make sure that we're approaching reading, that we're approaching literacy with the student's culture, with the student's world, with the student's language in mind. And I know you're really an expert on translanguaging. And so I'm wondering if you can really help us understand, for those of us that are multilingual educators, right? Monolingual educators, what is translanguaging? How can we increase the opportunities in our own classrooms? And how can that play into literacy?
I think, because I know we often talk about, throw terms out there, translanguaging, all these things. But I think, yes, I'm very fortunate in the last, probably the last decade, I've been researching in my own dissertation work at the time, and then now with Ophelia Garcia with the term translanguaging. That for me, what it is that we all have different linguistic codes that we bring, and whether it's just a lot of teachers that do not speak any other language other than English, sometimes say, oh, but I'm monolingual. And I'm like, well, you are monolingual, but you still have this repertoire, you have like a vernacular way of speaking in English and another way at home. So there's different ways that you can express themselves. Whereas bilinguals or multilinguals, we even have even a broader repertoire, if you can, or a linguistic resources that we have to express ourselves. And that's what it is, and so that's a way of what translanguaging is. I definitely think that it's integrated. These codes are definitely integrated, the vocabulary, the grammar. Whereas myself as a bilingual, sometimes when I express myself, even though I'm speaking in English, my discourse would be very much more from a Spanish speaking background, from my community, the home literacy and language that I acquired from my community. So that's what it is, and it's really leveraging your entire linguistic repertoire or resources that you have to express yourself, whether it's in speaking or when you read something and you make a point of recognizing a term that an author used that was in French or in Spanish, and it's an English text, and you're like, oh wow, I totally get why they use that. And so I think that's what it is, and actually, just bringing it to literacy, I think it's a very underused strategy for underrepresented student populations. For example, like English learners or emergent bilinguals, as I refer to them, because all English learners, that for me, it just connotes that, oh, they come in just learning, they're going to learn English, but no, they come with this whole linguistic repertoire that we can leverage. And there's not enough research in that in literacy. How do we use their translingual ways of expressing or even reading translingual texts like, Rodolfo Naya, Sandra Cisneros? There's just a lot of authors out there that write, for example, English texts that are sprinkled with Spanish or vice versa. And students, they're like really linguistic geniuses. They see that and they're like, oh my gosh, I know why he didn't use just town, a little town. He used pueblito because that means, in Spanish, it's a diminutivo. And they know that. I mean, like the things that they come up with, you're like, oh my gosh, wow. And so I think that's what translanguaging brings in. It brings, again, kind of going back to the excitement, the fun of part of them expressing and sharing what they know from written or oral texts that they read. And so I think even to that point, I know the National Academy of Education in 2010 came out with a report and some findings saying we are not leveraging translanguaging and students' home language and even their funds of knowledge from the work of Luis Moll, almost 3 decades, in literacy, and we need to do that. And this is a major finding. So I think hopefully we're moving more towards that because we've done plenty of reading first. We've done plenty of phonics as integral into literacy, but I don't know why as a field, and I hope this is where we're going with NSEL as well.
Thank you for that kind of clarification and definition. I'm wondering if we could take it one step further, because I've often heard that translanguaging is the same or very similar to code switching. So I'm wondering if you might clarify a little bit more about the differences and similarities between translanguaging and code switching.
Yes, most definitely. And I know with social linguists, I'm definitely a teacher, educator, and language developer with teachers. So I'm not a social linguist, but I work with a lot. But I know in the social linguist realm, there's a lot of tension with that. Mainly because, respectfully, I should say, because we've done extensive work, and myself as a bilingual person, I studied code switching. I started from Centea's Spanglish, the term that's used, and then most recently translanguaging. So for me, it's a trajectory in bilingual education that we've taken, where we've always been trying to acknowledge. I think translanguage has always existed. So when I found it a decade ago, I was like, oh my gosh, this is what I do. We just didn't name it that. So Spanglish is like, even I'm from Southern Texas, we call it Tex-Mex, or in California, they call it a different name and so forth. But I think with code switching, what I think is different, that terminology. So I kind of want to tip my hat to all of those. Not saying that, you know, Spanglish code switching, and now more modern term of translanguaging, or I shouldn't say modern, but a term that has been popularized a lot in the United States, coming from Europe, from Sen Williams. But the difference is that, you know, with code switching, we are always looking at the separation of those languages. There's, for example, for myself, English and Spanish, and we're always like, oh, this is what they did in English, this is what they did in Spanish. The big difference is that in translanguaging, we see it as a whole, kind of a holistic and integrated language repertoire that we choose at one point, you know, to express ourselves in X with this language, grammar, vocabulary, or discourse, and we express it. But in code switching, it's very much looking at it more from kind of two monolinguals in one. And so that, for me, that's the big distinction. Whereas I just see my bilingualism as just being as one, you know, pool of like rich resources there that I draw from, and that I'm not always like, oh, okay, you know, it just happens spontaneously, like I think that way and so forth. And so I think that's the big, but again, I think within, and I also see translanguaging as an umbrella. This is kind of my own metaphor, like an umbrella in which we, yes, at times we're going to translate, we'd use translation. Sometimes we're going to use some of that Spanglish, and also code switch, you know, where we're, to use that inclusive in that terminology. Now, you know, some social linguists don't think that way, but again, I'm a language developer. I work with teachers, so I want them to understand that it's not, the translation is not bad, code switching is not bad. These are all resources. And so we need to, but for me, I see it as kind of a very holistic and integrated way of expressing, rather than saying, okay, this is English, this is Spanish. And when we do that, especially in dual language programs, when we do that too much, it's, we don't allow the students to freely express themselves. And that kind of where the culturally sustaining and relevant and so forth. And that is important, though. And again, just things that I think in our literacy world that we haven't dared to do large scale research on, because I think once we do that, we're going to find that it's going to be very effective for our emergent bilinguals.
So you said a little bit about working with teachers and supporting teachers in their classrooms. So I'm wondering if you might talk, imagine you have a teacher who's a new teacher, maybe to a new district or even a new grade level. And so they're trying to get into their materials and they really want to understand the curriculum. But at the same time, they are also considering, who are my students and what is it that my students need? So as a teacher, support person, and educator, how are you helping those teachers to identify what components of their curriculum are particularly helpful for serving their multilingual students, whether it's in a monolingual setting, a dual setting? Are there some specific characteristics of curriculum that you think are particularly effective that teachers should be paying attention to?
That's a great question. I think, in teacher preparation, so just kind of thinking of my teachers, and I try to always survey my teachers and asking questions in regards to what curriculum are you using. I taught a biliteracy pedagogy course this spring that I was fortunate to be able to do some research with. And one of the things is that because of our state adopting, there was a dyslexia law and because of that, now our kinder to second grade have to be tested for dyslexia and the tools that they use, and then also learn structured literacy approach, for example. And some of the teachers, not some, most of them, and these were all graduate students that were coming back to finish their masters, and they were like, I come from a balanced literacy. I come from, they do GLAD, just different ways of approaching literacy. What do I do? And I'm like standing there like, my goodness. So I don't tell them, but we what we do is that then we study different things of different types of approaches. We looked at Kathy Escamilla's work with biliteracy from the start, some of the translanguaging biliteracy that I do. Some of the literacy even going back to the 70s of the Goodmans, and also structured literacy. We also looked at that. So I think that when they looked at that, they then came up. They had to do a biliteracy project. They came up. For example, one teacher compared and contrasted the structural literacy that she's doing with mini shared reading, for example. There's another approach that I use from Dr. Barbara Flores. And she did a whole work with her students and said, with a pair of students, I did the structural literacy with another pair of students. And again, these are teachers because teachers are researchers. And that's what I tell them. I say, you are researchers. You're practitioner researchers. And so I try to open up the space for them to be able to be these researchers and posing these questions. And they come with their own conclusion as I'm analyzing the data. They're like, wow, now this feature about structural literacy may or may not, but I'm going to have to adapt. So the main thing, takeaway is that they adapt. Again, there's not one size fits all with anything that we learn. And so them knowing kind of the theoretical underpinnings of specific literacy approaches and so forth, they're then able to make professional judgments and decisions for their students, and drawing from who they are, and not just from, we're always drawn to these assessments, technology-based assessments that they're timed and so forth. I said use that as a resource, but always find other assessments that what is it that the student, is it comprehension? Is it fluency? Is it vocabulary building? Is it meaning making? And so they come through their own conclusion of, more of a multi-dimensional type of way of approaching it. And that's for me important though, because I think as a former teacher, I never used a program, just to the T, because I had culturally and linguistically diverse students and different reading levels. There's just no way, no publisher is going to make one program tailor it for your specific student group. So I think that's a process that I take my teachers through. And I do that when I do professional development too, is that posing questions to them. And then really for them to create, for me, it's important for them to have teacher agency, because I think a lot of times we take it away from them in the way that we just push programs and assessments. And I think once they find that, that's very empowering. I mean, they then look at everything through a very critical lens.
Mm-hmm. So teacher as critical consumer, prioritizer, knowing their students, and then figuring out what components of their curriculum are going to work, and then what might they need to adjust in order to really meet the needs of each of their students.
Mm-hmm. Right? If we're not reading, if we're not writing, it's hard to teach that. It's hard to get to that metacognition. And so a really important question that we want to ask all of our guests is, what are you currently reading or writing, personally or professionally? No judgment whatsoever. We just want to hear it and celebrate it.
Yay, yes. Right now, I just finished reading actually, and I got the book because I was like, okay, I gotta get the. It is Song of the Hummingbird. Personally, I'm reading this by Graciela Limon, and again, it's her narrative, her perspective of the Spanish conquest in Mexico, and how Tenochtitlan and the Aztecs and so forth. Myself being indigenous Nahuatl, it was very important for me to read it. And again, all of us want to read something that is engaging, that you want to learn and so forth. So I think that I loved it, and I read it in the spring, but I actually use it and read it in my classroom, in my biliteracy classroom, as I read aloud. At the end, I didn't finish it this semester, but they were asking for the title so that they could read it. But so that's something that I most recently read from a personal interests, I guess. And the other one that I'm just finishing is called the Becoming Bilingual Readers. And it's identity translanguaging, of course, because that's what I study, and biographic biliteracy profiles by Bobby Cabuto. And an excellent way of looking at, she does draw from, of course, the Goodmans, and however, her work has really expanded into looking at, which I think the Goodmans, with the whole language and all that, of course, did a great job, but a lot of it was, again, with students that were English speakers, not a lot of multilingual students, by multilingual, and she does. And so I love that, because the way she looks at miscue analysis from a bilingual perspective is, for me, was like, wow, it blew my mind. So that's something that I'm reading right now, and really trying to see how to apply it. Again, different approaches, different methods, different ways that are current research and effective research, quantitative and qualitative, is important for me, because then going back to my teachers, providing that space for them to explore these and learn more and expand upon them in their own practice.
Okay, so we have 2 new books to put on our list. Thank you very much. We definitely are always talking about books, because books also help us through certain times, right? And so we are wondering, is there a book that you go back to? Is there a book that is your all-time favorite book? And, you know, it can be a favorite book from childhood, but is there a book that you have that when you think of what's your all-time favorite book, that kind of pops into your mind?
Well, does it have to be academic, or does it
No,
matter?
not at all.
Well, you know, I have to say, when you said childhood, I kind of going back to our cultural linguistically diverse students. Our home literacy looked very different. We didn't have very many books. We had the Bible, because we were Catholic, and we had periódicos, newspapers, and that was it. I think what my favorite book, in quotations, was listening to my father and my mother discuss our trip, or, you know, when we crossed the border to see my family, and we had these long conversations of the differences of, you know, why they use this term and so forth. So for me, that was very rich, and I, you know, to this day, as you can tell, I like to tell stories. is that that's just a discourse of mine that I use a lot, and I, that's what I remember. It's kind of a warm feeling in my heart, just sitting around the dinner table and listening to our daily account. You know, whether it was we were out in the fields working, or we were back home and listening to our adventures, because we're in a new school in California or so forth. That's very rich for me, and I just think of it. And to this day, even my own kids and my husband too, we're sit around the table and talk a lot. So those are oral texts that I have fond memories about.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much. That's making me think, Victoria, we may have to change the wording in our final question.
I think you're right, Anna.
More inclusive.
So thank you, Susana, for joining us today. We really are honored to spend this time with you. And we want to thank you for listening. We are the Effective Literacy Podcast. And for more information and to get access to all the resources mentioned today, please visit our show notes at multilingualliteracy.org. And make sure to subscribe to our podcast and let your friends know that we're out here and we're excited to be chatting with you. All right, take care.